When Israel settled into the promised land first, they enjoyed a time of freedom, the likes of which no people had ever enjoyed up until that time. The bad news is no one since that time has enjoyed that level of freedom again. I don't think very many people understand the basis of that freedom and what it took to maintain the freedom that Israel enjoyed in those few years. It wasn't merely a matter of God handing them everything on a silver platter. You're my people, you just do the right thing, and I'll take care of everything else. That's not really the way it was. They had to fight for the land, they had to fight for their freedom, and they had to work like the devil for their prosperity. Now, if you are a Bible reader and you've really given this much of a thought in the light of your experience of your life, you're going to understand and know that's true. God just doesn't rain it on you. He doesn't just hand it to you on a silver platter. He doesn't wait on you hand and foot. What God does is open doors for you, but you still got to do the fighting. You still got to do the work. None of the things that they had in those early years of freedom would have worked without the foundation of freedom. Moses gave a speech that I want to come to. Israel was given a law and a system of worship designed to maintain the law, to implant it in their national memory, to shape the national conscience. And there is such a thing as a national conscience. Here's what Moses had to say in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 23. Take heed to yourself, lest you forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and make yourself a graven image, or the likeness of anything which the Lord your God has forbidden you. Don't do that. Be careful about it, because the Lord your God is a consuming fire, even a jealous God. He doesn't say God's going to become one. He said he is one. And so you need to be very attentive to this deal that we have made together. When you shall beget children and children's children, and you have remained long in the land, and shall corrupt yourself, and make a graven image, or the likeness of anything, and then begin to do evil in the sight of the Lord your God, to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. You shall soon utterly perish from off the land where you're going to possess it. You shall not prolong your days upon it. You shall be utterly destroyed. What he seems to be telling them here is that idolatry, the abandonment of the worship of God, turning away to other gods, was the first step they would take in losing their freedom. Later in Deuteronomy 6, he says this. It's a familiar scripture. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. And these words that I command you this day shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently unto your children. You shall talk about them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you get up. You shall talk about these laws all the time and teach them diligently to your children. You bind them upon a sign upon your hand, they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them upon the post of your houses and upon your gates. In other words, the law of God is to be the dominating presence in your life. Now, there are two very big things here. One of them is the danger of idolatry and the natural result that comes from idolatry in the decay of the fabric of the people because of neglect of law. The other thing, as I said, two of them. The other is the law of God, not in the legalistic sense, but in the moral sense of a lamp to your feet and a light to your path. The truth is that the first of these two things, that is the adherence to God himself personally, the staying away from idols, not allowing yourself to be drawn astray from the worship of God, that is the more crucial of the two. And the reason for that is that if you stray in matters of law, it is the first, that loyalty to God, that lights the way for your return to God. It is that thing which draws you back to God again. One of the classic examples of this is found in the history of Israel. When the break took place between the house of Israel in the north and the house of Judah in the south. And Jeroboam the first, who was king of Israel, the house of Israel in the north, was worried about the fact that if these people keep going to Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles every year, their heart will return to God and their king, and they'll kill me. He just understood it. He said that feast, in other words, the worship of God, what some people would call ceremonial law, will light the way for these people to return to God. They will want to be one again. And he was right. They would have wanted to be. But because he then established a feast in the 15th day of the 8th month as a substitute festival, he placed the place of worship at the south end of his kingdom so that people wouldn't have to go all the way to Jerusalem to worship God. He put one at the north for those people to make it easier for them. And he changed the worship of God, the days of the worship of God, and everything about it. We have no idea how far he went with those changes. What was the result? Well, in the 200 plus years of the history of the northern kingdom, there was never at any time a return to God. Not once. Now in Judah, in the south, they strayed, they went down the wrong pathways, then they repented, then they came back, and the list of the kings of Judah is good, good, bad, 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 worse than that, better, better, good. You know, you have that kind of a list of kings that are there. In the north, in Jeroboam's kingdom, it's bad, bad, worse, 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 until finally you come to a man like Ahab, and finally they went down, they went out, and there was never, ever a revival in the north, because the light was blown out that would have shown the way back to God. Now, almost everyone misunderstands the law. They misunderstand both aspects of the law. They misunderstand the ceremonial, as they would call it, and they misunderstand the moral. They take off from the legalistic assumption of the strictest Jewish sects and position themselves either for or against the law. The idea is, well, if I keep the law, God will bless me and will save me. Or, if I break the law, God will curse me and God will hate me. Both ideas are dead wrong. Another common mistake. Well, I keep the law of God, but I do it not because I'm required to, but because I love God and I want to do so. It will make God happy if I keep the law. Well, this is a big mistake too. I'm going to ask you, for the sake of this sermon today, to put all these ideas into a little box, tie a ribbon on it, and put it on the shelf of your mind for an hour. You can always go back to it later if you still want to. But for now, I want us to look at something a little different and a different idea on this issue. It was James who coined the phrase that I want us to focus on for a while this afternoon. It's in his first chapter, verse 22. He said, "Be you doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves." James 1, verse 22. "For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks at his natural face in a glass, and he sees himself, and he goes his way straightway and forgets what kind of man he really is. Whoever, though, looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues therein, not being a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man will be blessed in his deed." The perfect law of liberty. Why does James choose that expression for it? And what does he mean by it? What does the idea of the perfect law of liberty do? In what way is the law of God a law of liberty? For I can assure you, the idea of liberty is not in that little box that we just put a ribbon around and placed on the shelf for the time being. Now, I want to illustrate this. I want to illustrate the principles that are involved in this perfect law of liberty by taking you back to the beginning of the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 2, Verse 1, beginning here. Israel has finally come through. They have finally conquered the land. They've begun to settle the land by lot, and we're nearing the end of Joshua's life. In chapter 2, verse 1, an angel of the Lord came from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I made you go up out of the land of Egypt. I've brought you into the land which I swore to your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you. I promised you this. We made this deal. You shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. You will throw down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice in this. Why have you done this? You know, we understood each other. I thought we came up out of the land. I told you we're going to drive these people out, but I don't want you to make any deals with these people. I don't want you to make any covenants with these people. You are to drive them out of the land completely. And if they won't go, you're to kill them off, essentially, is what he had told them. So I said, you're not going to do that. I will not drive them out from before you. They will be as thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. So you remember what I said earlier when I said this, that they had to fight for the land? They had to fight for the land. They had to fight for their freedom. They had to drive these people out. But if they had done that, then God would have worked with them, and God would have driven them out completely. But they didn't do it. Why didn't they do it? I honestly, have a hard time understanding myself why, after all these years looking back, they didn't follow instructions. They just, I guess, felt sorry for those poor people. They felt sorry for them. They felt guilty about it. They perhaps didn't feel like it was right for them to drive these people out of their homes where they had been for generations. Of course, they had no idea what those people were doing behind closed doors. They had no idea what kind of lives they lived, but they did know one thing. God says, don't make any deals with these people. Drive them out of the land. And now he says, why didn't you do that? Well, because you didn't, then I'm not going to do it for you. And they're going to sit there, and they're going to be thorns in your sides and your eyes for generation after generation after generation, and it would seem that that is still true to this day. Well, it came to pass when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel, they lifted up their voice and they wept. And they called the name of the place Bochim. That's where the name came from, which means the weepers. And they sacrificed there unto the Lord. And when Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man to his inheritance to possess the land. Okay, we're going to have thorns in our sides and our briars and so forth for all of these generations, but we're here now. We are free men. It's your land. Go take it and possess it. Then comes this note. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. In these early years of the book of Judges, Israel was more free than they ever had been, and more free than they ever would be again in the course of events. Why was that true? Well, in the early years, they maintained two things intact. That is, one, the worship of God at his appointed times, systematically and deliberately, and two, they taught their children the law as the underpinnings of a civil society. Now, what I just said to you is more important than you're going to realize yet, that the teaching of children the law provides the moral underpinnings of a civil society. For without those moral underpinnings, civil society isn't possible. Living free requires character. Character requires an internalized morality based upon divinely revealed absolutes. I mean, these things are absolute. When God says truth is truth and lie is lie, that's the way it is. There's no gray in between them. The morality that undergirds the character of a free people has to be based on divine authority and divine revealed law. If we base it on our own authority, if we base it on our own values, we may sit around and philosophize and create a set of values that we like because we think these are the ones that work, and history has shown that it's true, and all the philosophers agree that it is so. We can do that. We can create these values. Problem with it is, if we create them, we can change them. We can change them at will. And merely because I violate a set of values that we kind of sort of agreed on as a group of people, that doesn't mean it's not a big deal. If I violate the law of God, that's a very big deal. That's why our Declaration of Independence in this country states the source of our rights is the Creator, not the King. And this was the distinction that they were drawing in those days, and it was a deliberate distinction. Our rights derive from God, not from the state, not from the government, not from the king, not from even all the people that we live with in this country. Their rights derive from God. It was this presumption that made our liberty possible. But the Creator makes certain demands as a part of that guarantee. The guarantee of our liberties, the guarantee of our freedom is not unconditional. Now let's go back to the book of Judges to try to understand this a little bit more depth. In Judges chapter 2, verse 8, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died 110 years old, and they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres in the mount of Ephraim on the north side of the hill Gash. And I presume for an awful long time you could go there and visit the tomb of Joshua. I'd have liked to have done that if I'd known where it was. Also, all that generation were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, which did not know the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. And this is one of the most tragic statements I've ever read. For they had a chance. How come the generation that rose up after them didn't know God? Whose fault was that? The parents. Who else? The families, the nation, the people, everyone around them who might have taught them about God didn't do it. They did not recount year by year. You know, we were slaves in Egypt, and God brought us out of Egypt. We walked dry shod across the bottom of the Red Sea. My grandfather was there. He said he actually stuck his hand in the water, and it was like a wall to him. They didn't tell those stories to their children. Those stories all died out. Now, what happened then as a result of that? Well, because they didn't know God any longer, because they were not taught the law of God, they had no basis, they had no foundation upon which their moral structure could be built. It was, if it feels good, do it. If it's not hurting anybody, we might as well go ahead and do it. Or if it's a part of our value system, then it's okay. And we might change our value system tomorrow because we didn't like how it worked yesterday. That's where they came to as a people. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Baal. They forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods, of the people who were around them. And they bowed themselves to them and provoked the Lord to anger. And they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. Why would they do that? Well, there are reasons for it. For one thing, the freedom that they enjoyed during the period of the judges, the period in which God had placed them in the land as their God and he was their king, there was no physical king. They were free to do what seemed good to them, but they didn't know because they weren't taught what was good. And God was out of sight. He did not interfere with their freedom on a day-by-day basis. But Baal and Ashtaroth, there were constant reminders of them and the images that were there. Well, the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of the spoilers that spoiled them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so they could no longer stand before their enemies. Now, when I read this, I have to ask myself, what did God do to make that happen? Because the fact is, he really didn't have to do much of anything. Because once the nation's character began to go in the toilet, they couldn't stand against their enemies whether God was on their side or not. Because again, remember, I said they had to fight for the land. They had to fight for their freedom. They had to stand up and be counted. They couldn't just expect it to be handed to them. And God wasn't about to hand it to a people who had turned their back on him and followed Baal and Ashtaroth. Their freedom was so short-lived. One generation was all it took. Just one. And they were gone. One word about Ashtaroth. She's called in the textbooks a fertility goddess, which I think is a bit of a delicate way to refer to her. What she was, in all of her manifestations, was a sex goddess. She was all about what people call sexual love, and you can forget the word love because it's irrelevant to what was going on here. She is the most powerful of all the pagan gods and goddesses, the most powerful and the most pervasive throughout the Middle East. All the nations of the Middle East had their unique male gods. One served Baal, another served Moloch, another served Dagon. They had all their gods were down through there. We had our national god. But what is really interesting is that all those gods had a consort, and the consort of all those gods was the same goddess, Ashtaroth. She was everywhere. And in fact, if you go through the Middle East looking at archaeological remains and looking at where they came from, Palestine, the entire area, was in ancient times just littered with small and large little figurines of Ashtaroth. And that's the one, you may have seen it if you ever look at those pictures. She is the one with rather large breasts and her hands cupped under her breast, holding them out to the person who is, whoever it might be, who is before her. She is a sex goddess. Now, as all of us know by now, sex is a very powerful emotion, or a very powerful drive in human beings. And so they managed to tap into that with her. She's not worshiped by name in our society today, but she is worshiped nonetheless, in principle and the way people live their lives. Now, we have to think, I think, very carefully about what happened here. Yes, God sold them into the hands of their enemies. But the truth is, there were very few people among them at that time who had the stomach for standing up against their enemies. They had just learned to roll over. When I read this, I couldn't help thinking of a quotation. I'm currently reading Winston Churchill's The Gathering Storm. I've been reading it for a long time because I read it a little bit here and a little bit there. He said this, "Still, if you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when your victory will be sure and not too costly, you may come to the moment when you will have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. There may be an even worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope of victory, because it is better to perish than to live as slaves." Winston Churchill. One of the problems Israel had come to, they no longer believed that it was better to perish than to live as slaves. They would have rather knuckled under to the Philistines. They would have rather let the Philistines run their lives for them. And there was a point in time where the Philistines would not even allow Israel to have anything to sharpen iron tools with. They had to go down to the Philistines and pay money to have their farming utensils sharpened by the Philistines, because they weren't allowed to have the means to do so. They had that much control over them. Thomas Jefferson said, "The tree of liberty is watered with the blood of every generation." It's true, and it was true then too, that if they were going to continue to live as free men, they were going to have to be prepared to fight for it. But because they had been suckered into the worship of Baal and Ashtaroth, because they had then lost track of the law of God, the law of God was no longer the foundation of their liberty. It was no longer, the law of liberty was no longer the guiding light of their life that determined how they lived their life. They were now their own law. They now made their own value decisions. And as a result of it, they didn't have what it took. If I read Judges correctly, we will always have enemies. Always. Jesus also made that clear enough. He said, time's going to come when he that kills you will think he does God a service. So we're going to always have enemies. And if we lose the law of liberty, we will lose the character required to stand before those enemies. Because it is in the teaching of the law of God to our children, not in a legalistic sense, but as a lamp to their feet, a guide to their life, as the exemplar of morality and of the difference between right and wrong. If we teach our children these things, if we ingrain them into their character, they will grow up strong enough to oppose their enemies and stand before them. Without those things, they don't have what it takes. Judges 2, verse 16. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. I mean, every once in a while, God felt sorry for them. And he sent along a Jephthah, a Gideon, a Samson, and he delivered them at certain times in their history. But they went a-whoring after other gods and bowed themselves to them. It's interesting, the expression went a-whoring. That was a lot more literal then. I started to say more literal then than it is now, but I don't know that it is. They bowed themselves to them. They turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in, obeying the commandments of the Lord. Yeah, they never did it. They wouldn't turn back. And the Lord raised up, when the Lord raised them up judges, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For he felt sorry for them because of their groanings and by reason of them that perplexed them and oppressed them. It came to pass that when the judge was dead, they went right back and corrupted themselves more than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and to bow down to them. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. Liberty has its way and its price. Liberty has its way. There is a way that one must walk, and it also has its price. In the time of the judges, time would pass, and the terrible cycle repeated itself over and over again. And finally, in the days of one of the best of the judges, the people had just had all they could bear, and they could see the cycle was going to repeat itself one more time. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1, it came to pass, 1 Samuel 8, verse 1, it came to pass when Samuel was old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of the firstborn was Joel, the name of the second was Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after money, took bribes, and perverted judgment. And all I can conclude from this is that Samuel, in the press of his duties, Samuel, traveling as a circuit preacher all over Israel, neglected the upbringing of his sons. He did not give it the attention it deserved. And now he's old. Now his energy level is beginning to decline. And now he can't handle those boys any longer. So the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel in Ramah, and they said to him, look, you're old. Your sons are no longer walking in your ways. Now make us a king to rule over us. We want a king to judge us like all the nations round about us, the people who walk over us continually. Well, the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us, because he knew what was at stake. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, you know, what a remarkable man this is, that God would just talk to him. Talked to him when he was a little boy in bed at night, called him by name and said, Samuel, and he gave him his message. He could actually, I guess, hear God's voice. The Lord said to him, listen to the voice of the people in all they say to you, for they have not rejected you, they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Now this is one of the most telling scriptures in the entirety of the Bible, because it tells us, first of all, God never intended for Israel to have a monarchy. Never intended it. What he wanted them to have was the golden age that they had for the first generation after they got into the land. He wanted it to be a little better than that, actually, because he wanted them to drive those other nations completely out of their borders, and they didn't do it. But nevertheless, their golden age of freedom was that first generation after they came into the land and obeyed God. God was their king. He didn't interfere with a great deal of their lives. He didn't make great demands of them as a people. That by and large, all he wanted of them was them to study the law and to worship with him and to meet with him at the appointed times. That's all he wanted of them, and for them to learn and internalize the law of God so that they could live it day in and day out. That's what he wanted. And they could have done so, free, with each man ruling his own family, with each grandfather kind of leading his own group, a larger family, with the great-grandfathers and the patriarchs all being able to gather around and influence the behavior of fathers and sons and grandsons. This is the kind of thing that was existing then. You needed money for something, you had a project need to be done, you gathered all the local people together, talked it over, got the money to do it, and built your project, whatever it was you needed to do at this time. If you wanted to move a rock, if you wanted to build a pathway or a road or something, you could do it as a community at this time in their history. They had complete freedom. Oh yeah, they were expected to pay tithes, but I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not. But in reading carefully through the Bible, you will find no Internal Revenue Service. There were no audits. No one came around knocking on your door demanding your tithe. No one took anything out of your bank account. The tithe was an act of worship. You actually had to sit down before your God, calculate what you wanted and what you should, what you owed to him, really. Because after all, he gave you the land you're working. He has given you your children, your grandchildren. He's given you everything you have, and this is a part of your deal, part of your covenant. Don't you want to include your wealth as a part of your deal with God, or do you want to exclude that from it? No, I want it in. I want that part of the deal. So it was your choice to tithe or not tithe. It was wrong if you didn't, but there was no one there to see to it that you did. There was no one there to see to it that you kept the Sabbath. There was no one there to see to it that you didn't eat food that God had prohibited you to eat. You were supposed to know this. It was supposed to be internalized. You were supposed to be doing these things as a matter of character, not as a matter of some external enforcement and obligation. And this is what is meant by the freedom of this time. Well, he said, listen to them. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works they have done since the day I brought them up out of the land of Egypt to this day, wherein they have forsaken me and served other gods. Samuel, they're doing exactly the same thing to you that they have done to me ever since we crossed the Red Sea. Now listen to their voice, but protest solemnly to them, and tell them what the manner of the king is going to be that shall reign over them. No people ever had a better chance at living free. No people, no one had ever had a better deal, and no one has had a better deal since. Every family, as I said, was led by its elder, as was every tribe. Every problem was settled right where the problem arose. There was no need to go somewhere else with it. People gave you their word, and they kept it. You could shake hands on a deal, and you didn't need a written contract. There were men of courage who would fight for their families. They would fight like a tiger with whatever it was they had at hand. They would protect their children and their wives and their grandchildren. That was the kind of people they were. But you see, all this was founded on a deal they had made with Yahweh, Jehovah, their God. That's why they were this kind of people. It included a system of worship at appointed times. It included a law that outlined the morality of civil society. When they ran off after Astarte, they became morally and spiritually castrated. They were unmanned. And the evidence for that is found in the books. It's shot all the way through Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. When these people took off after these other gods, and particularly after Astarte, who was really, I suspect, the focal point of the whole thing, because it is through sex that the society was really undermined in its initial ways. They did become unmanned, morally and spiritually. Well, 1 Samuel chapter 8, Samuel gathered the people together, and he told all the words of the Lord to the people that asked of him a king. And he said this, here's the way it's going to work. This will be the manner of the king that's going to reign over you. He will take your sons and your daughters, or take your sons first of all, and appoint them for himself, for his chariots to be his horsemen, and some of them shall have to run before his chariots. Now, first of all, let me stop and tell you one thing. Horses were not used for agriculture in the ancient world at all. You didn't know that, didn't you? They were not. They were engines of war. Horses and chariots are the equivalent of an armored division, put enough of them together. It's like a division of tanks. Tanks, Humvees, armored things. This is what horses and chariots were in this time. They were for the purpose of fighting. He will appoint them for himself, for his chariots, to be his horsemen, and some of them shall run before his chariots. He will appoint him, the ones that rode the horses, they were the cavalry. The ones that ran before them, they were the infantry. He will appoint them captains over thousands, captains over 50s, and set them to ear his ground and reap his harvest, to make his instruments of war and instruments for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. He will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And here we are. We thought we had solved this problem with the United States Constitution, that we couldn't take any man's property to give to another man. And the Supreme Court just threw that one right out the window in the street. And they now take your property if it's for the good of the community, something that was not supposed to happen because the founders understood the principle. You don't do that. He will take the tenth of your seed, of your vineyards, and give them to his officers and to his servants. I really wish it had only gotten that bad. But we go way beyond a tenth of our stuff that we have to give to the government. He'll take your men servants, your maid servants, your goodliest young men. He's going to take your asses and put them to his work. He'll take a tenth of your sheep. And you will be his servants. Now, when you get down to that point, you're going to cry out in that day because of your king, which you have chosen, and the Lord won't hear you in that day. The time's going to come when you're just going to be moaning and groaning, and God, get rid of this king. Get rid of this government. We don't want this anymore. And God's going to say, did someone say something? I didn't hear it. Nevertheless, Samuel told him, stood up there and said, this is the way it's going to be. Nevertheless, the people, they wouldn't listen. They said, no, we will have a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us, and, by the way, go out before us and fight our battles. Now the truth comes out. Because this is really what it was about. It was about the fact that they were so tired of the Philistines. They were so tired of their other neighbors who terrorized them day in, day out, month in and month out. They were so tired of not being their own men any longer, of having to go see somebody else about getting a weapon sharpened, about plowing a plot of ground and getting it grown up to a certain level, and a bunch of bandits come through and harvest their crop and take it away from them. They were so tired of this. He said, no, we want a king to go out before us and fight our battles. They had finally become unmanned by living without God. They just weren't the men that they were, that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had been before them. This line, that our king may go out and before us and fight our battles, is enough to make you weep. And it's a spirit that pervades our society right now, today. Let the government do it. Or, as I overheard a man say once upon a time, let the government pay for it. He forgot that the government's paying for it with his money. Still worse, let the government fight our battles, forgetting that it's the blood of our sons and our daughters that will pay that bill. The king didn't fight. I mean, he did. In those days, the king needed to be a big man, needed to be a warrior, because they did go out at least go out at the head of their armies. But they wouldn't win those battles by themselves. It was the sons and the daughters of the people who wanted a king that had to go out and fight those battles, just like they had always done in the past, if they had had the courage to fight. The problem is, they needed somebody to draft them and force them to fight. It was the only way it could be made to work. I've read the memoirs of Tommy Franks, his book, An American Soldier. What a fine piece of work, and I recommend it to all of you as an important book to read. I rate it in the top rank of all the books I've ever read. Here is a man who was cut from the mold of a Samson and a Gideon. Very wild youth that the young man had. He flunked out of the University of Texas. He drank too much. He fooled around, chased, the girls too much. He just, whatever it was, did the worst that the kids do. But there came a point in time where all that changed in his life. And the Army was one of the things that made that change take place. He went in the Army, by the way, as an enlisted man, and rose all the way to a 4-star general commanding Central Command. He's a man who loves your sons and daughters and understands more than most in Congress seem to about the price that has to be paid for liberty. It's clear in his book. And he has a clear, warm, and loving relationship and loving feeling about the men and women who go to battle. And I saw him speak, listened to him speak in Dallas not long ago, and I was struck by the kind of man that he was. He is also a fighting man who has stood in the forefront of battle and knows what it takes to win. And the story of how they had to put together both Desert Shield finally and then Desert Storm, and then, of course, the battle for Iraq that we have now more recently had, the story of the preparations and all those things will absolutely boggle your mind and increase your admiration not only for the fighting skills of our military and of our men, but of the organizational skills without which the fighting would not be very effective. But now, when we face the test of our generation, enlistments in the Army are down sharply. You probably have heard about that on television. There are two reasons for this, at least. One, we have killed off most of a generation that would be the young people who today would be being recruited for and serving in the military. They were destroyed, some 40 million Americans, before they ever took the breath of life. They won't be here to pay Social Security, and they won't be here to fight for their country. They are gone. And they're gone because, in a way, it may seem like a stretch to you, but it's not to me. They are gone because of Astarte, the sex goddess, whom we all wanted to have. Everybody wanted to have the freedom, do whatever they wanted sexually and not have to accept the responsibilities for it. At first expressions were in the pill or, the anti-conception devices. Then finally we come around to the place to where, well, if you still got one on the way, you can kill it off. You can abort this fetus. And we've come down to the place now to where they can partially bring a little fellow or a little girl into the world and kill it at that point. As I think George Will said, the difference between infanticide and partial birth abortion is 4 inches. That part of the child that still has not emerged from the birth canal. And that's all. That's the whole thing. That's the first one. We've killed off through abortion 40 million who would be around to pay Social Security, who would be willing around to enlist in the Army and fight, have jobs, and help build the prosperity of the country. The second thing is the political leadership of this country simply cannot get their act together. They are so consumed with grasping after power, they cannot restrain themselves from criticizing the war which is being fought by their own sons and daughters. They just can't help themselves because, and it is purely, understand this, it is purely a matter of grasping after political power, nothing more. I was so struck yesterday, I heard a British politician. He was a Tory, member of Parliament, who is the opposition party in Great Britain. And his point was, no, there aren't going to be any politics over this issue. Not over this, not because of this. We are one party in defense of our country. I hope the rest of his people in his party feel that way, because that is the conservative or right wing of British politics. It's the left wing of British politics that's in power at the present time. But the British understand this. They long ago in their history, in World War II, in the beginnings of World War II, when they realized finally they had to fight it, they put together what they called a national government, composed of all the political parties. It was no longer liberals, Tory, Labor, Tory, no longer any of that. They realized if they were going to survive, they had to be together on the question of the war. They fought it out before the war. But when the war started, the fighting about politics was over. They say, these politicians in our country do, they support the troops and then they demoralize the troops by poor-mouthing the battles and the war that they are fighting over there and declaring it's a wrong war in the wrong time at the wrong place. And I don't want to particularly pick on one party or the other one, because both parties make stupid mistakes and both parties tend to grasp for power and they don't consider the consequences of the things that they do and say. This is part of our liberty, this ability to speak this way. But it's a costly exercise when we can't learn how to disagree in time of war. And I will tell you categorically that the leadership of our country have not figured that out yet. They do not understand how to disagree in time of war. And part of it is because the war at the moment is not being fought here. The British, all of a sudden, it came home with a rush. How long did we hold together after 9/11? Was it 9 months? Was it 12? Before things started coming unstuck again? It wasn't long. There are too many of our people giving aid and comfort to the enemy, and they're doing it because they've been seduced by other gods. They've been unmanned by sex, by drink, by drugs, and now they are unmanning a generation of young people who might fight for them and their grandchildren someday if they had what it took to fight. I don't know if many of them will. And it all begins with abandoning God, with driving God out of schools and classrooms and courthouses. There are those who argue that Christian people should shut up about politics. I don't think Christian people should shut up about anything. I think that we should have a voice about everything, and we should feel free to express that opinion about everything. If our politicians in Washington, D.C. have the right to criticize the war in Iraq and undermine the morale of our troops who are fighting it, we ought to have the power to criticize them in turn as Christian people. There are those who want to shove the Christian faith out of the public square entirely. You have compartmentalized. You can have your faith over here, but don't let your faith intervene over here. I think Christians should be prominent in the public square as Christians, known to be, that it shows in their life, it shows in their decisions, and who feel free to say so at every turn. There are those of us who want to keep our Christianity in a compartment of our lives, out of our jobs, out of our careers, apart from our politics. I think we should be total Christians. Our Christianity should affect everything we do. If you're an artist, it should find its way into the paint that you put on canvas. If you're a sculptor, it should find its way through your hands to the image that you are making, to the statue, to the bust, to the pottery that you are making. If you're a mechanic, that character of a Christian character should find its way into the making and repairing of automobiles and farm machinery and whatever you do. We should be total Christians. It should affect every aspect of our life. And I'm not just talking about saying, do you know the Lord, brother, to the guy in the cubicle next to you. I'm talking about the way you do your job and the way you live your life as an exemplar. Our faith should be manifest in everything we do and in every battle we fight, and we should shrink from no battles. Finally, Samuel listened to the words of the people, and he rehearsed in them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and make them a king." So Samuel told the men of Israel, "Okay, go every man to his own city." It is, and I think it was, one of the saddest days in the history of the world. It is the day when a great people laid down their liberty.